Welcome to Alaska Weather, a production of Alaska Public Media and the National Weather Service, Alaska Region. Produced and broadcast daily from the studios of KAKM, Alaska Weather provides complete forecasts, public, marine, and aviation for all of Alaska. Alaska Weather is made possible by the following sponsors.
The National Weather Service.
Good Saturday, everyone. I'm meteorologist Dave Snider with the National Weather Service. It's the 13th of February now. As always, we encourage you to stay up to date with your local weather information. If you've been doing that at weather.gov/Alaska, you would already know there is a blizzard warning still in effect for the North Slope. The North Slope's under blizzard conditions through most of last night and early this morning. All the way from Icy Cape eastward is what we're talking about. And as of earlier this morning, about 11 o'clock or so, these were some of the 24-hour maximum gusts that had been reported. There certainly have been more since this point, but you can see some of the weather cameras plotted from our friends at the FAA and their aviation weather cameras, which many of you aviators use on a routine basis there, showing whiteout conditions in many locations from Barrow to Prudhoe Bay and Dead Horse and all the way out toward Point Lay. So conditions have not really improved, and we're not expecting them to improve until after about 6 o'clock tomorrow morning, when conditions will start to slowly improve. It's not going to be an immediate, wow, everything's better and here we go. It's going to be a slow and gradual improvement, probably on through Sunday afternoon and into the evening, but it shouldn't qualify as a blizzard anymore, which you well know has to have at least 3 hours or so of 35-mile-an-hour winds, under a quarter-mile visibility, and falling snow, and certainly blowing snow on top of that is something we've experienced in this case. So just really rough conditions for the North Slope. Haven't had a whole lot of widespread blizzard condition making systems like we have right now. But it seems to be the case tonight. And again, blizzard warnings in effect for all the red shaded areas until 6 o'clock Sunday morning. So stay alert, stay tuned, and stay out of danger by staying inside. Across the winter weather advisory area here in yellow, again, blowing snow and poor visibility there. That could extend as far south as the Sag River DOT camp there. So be careful and take it easy out there. Here's a look at the satellite picture, and you can see several waves of weather working up through the north and eastern Gulf Coast. A little bit of a break in the weather for southeast today. Clouds moving through, but still another system starting to build in from the south. You can already see that working its way northward. Clouds across the south and western coast of the Gulf. A little break in the cloud cover north of the Alaska Range. Not a whole lot of active weather to report there, but the main focus along this boundary here, you can see this comma-shaped cloud stretching out across the Chukchi Seacoast from Barrow and eastward, where a lot of the lift and snow-making weather is occurring, not to mention the driving wind from the east. And then you have this feeding in from the Bering Seacoast and the YK Delta that's helping to get that moisture up into the weather system there. A zone of low pressure is forming here. We've had this wave trying to develop now on the weather models for the last couple days, and it looks like that's the case now at 1,002 millibars. It's now on the chart. Areas of snow, falling snow and blowing snow, and blizzard conditions again being reported across the Arctic coast. Low pressure just south and east of Kodiak Island, connected to an occlusion working north and east. Pockets of rainfall along that region, but not nearly as widespread as we sometimes see. By tonight, another wave will lift northward. That's still west of Haida Gwaii at 998 millibars. Pockets of rainfall along the north and western coast, and we might see that mix at times with rain and snow. This is not going to be a big event for anything across the Cook Inlet region. Still very dry conditions shaping up there. Hit and miss flakes, flurries, and maybe a drip or two of drizzle, but doesn't look like anything that's going to really wet or snow anything out. Out across the west, the cold air is trying to march inward, and as it does so, clouds will form around Norton Sound and the Seward Peninsula, including Nome. You might see a snow shower or two up across the south-facing zone of the Brooks Range. There's a better chance for that. Look for slightly drier conditions around the Northway area. North to Eagle, you'll see more clouds and, again, blowing snow across the North Slope. Out in the west, another wave of weather marches eastward and then falls apart. Low pressure sitting across the eastern Aleutians will also start to diminish its intensity across the northern and eastern Gulf. It was never that intense to begin with. Look for pockets of rainfall there across southeast, the north and western Gulf Coast. If it sounds like a broken record, it surely is. This is a weather pattern we've had for weeks. And across the areas of the south-facing slopes of the Alaska Range, spotty areas of rain and snow showers. The colder air out west just can't march eastward, and neither can the warmer air, not marching northward. The cyclone, or area of low pressure, is still there, and there's still a pretty tight pressure gradient across the north slope. Here's Sunday. Remember, Sunday morning is when the blizzard warning is set to right now at 6 a.m. for conditions to ease at least a little bit. And then as we get into Monday, look at the pressure gradient. Starts to fall apart. That wave of low pressure scoots eastward, finally moving along and falling apart. High pressure settles in behind it at 1,014 millibars, and conditions start to subside. But they're not gone yet. There's still snow. There's probably still a pretty decent little easterly breeze right along the coast. But out across the west now, things start to focus westward at 962 millibars. A new wave moves into the extreme western Bering Sea. The winds come up across the central and western chain with rain and snow showers there, and low pressure works into the central and eastern Gulf at 982 millibars. So signs of change, but the change won't really set in until we probably get into Monday or Tuesday. Temps across southeast today back in the mid to upper 40s. You saw some of that milder weather all the way around to Seward and Homer. 34 in Anchorage, 32 in Talkeetna, 20 in Fairbanks today. A mild afternoon for you for sure. And 34 in Eagle with Fort Yukon at 18, 16 in Arctic Village. The North Slope anywhere from 3 above in Kaktovik to 5 below in Barrow. Kivalina at 7, Kotzebue 4, Shishmaref 3, 10 around Unalakleet, 16 in Grayling, and 12 in McGrath. All the way down toward Bethel, it was 23 degrees. St. Lawrence Island saw 3 this afternoon, 35 in Cape Newenham, Dillingham and King Salmon in the 30s and 40s, 37 in Kodiak today, upper 30s for most of the Alaska Peninsula. Sandpoint almost 40 degrees, St. Paul 36, 37 in Adak, and 33 in Shemya. Overnight low temperatures will stay in the 20s to maybe 30s along the Gulf Coast, 39 in Kodiak, upper 30s to lower 40s for southeast. 3 in Fairbanks, 2 in Arctic Village, 2 below in Barrow, and Nome looking at 6 below with southwest in the teens and 20s, Bristol Bay near freezing. The Alaska Peninsula in the mid to upper 30s, St. Paul 31, and Shemya holding at 30 degrees overnight. As we get into Sunday afternoon, look for highs in the low to mid 40s for most of southeast. Yakutat closer to 40, the capital city right there. 36 in Cordova with Valdez at 22 tomorrow. Look for 36 around Anchorage, 35 in Talkeetna, 22 in Healy, 16 for Denali, 9 in Arctic Village, and 3 for Barrow. For the Seward Peninsula, Shishmaref will look at 1 tomorrow afternoon for a high, 12 in Nome, 19 in Nunivak Island, and mid-30s for Bristol Bay. Bethel looking at 26, Heisner 40 for the Alaska Peninsula, close to freezing for the Pribilofs, and mid to upper 30s for most of the central and eastern chain. Flying weather tomorrow still includes IFR conditions from Point Barrow eastward along the Beaufort Seacoast. Pockets of IFR around Kotzebue Sound, especially interior into the south-facing slopes there, and then clearing up quickly once you get past the Kobuk and Noatak valleys. IFR conditions along some of the higher terrain in central and northern parts of southeast, all the way into parts of Prince William Sound. MVFR conditions around the Chugach, but mainly in the Prince William Sound side. The Cook Inlet looks pretty good. IFR conditions around Bristol Bay tomorrow afternoon, the Pribilofs, and for the eastern Aleutians, including Nikolsky, not quite as far west, though, as Atka. Pass conditions then, AKwx Pass looking for VFR conditions to be seen by the afternoon. We expect similar conditions to develop in Adigan Pass throughout the day. Lake Clark and Merrill Pass are going to lean over toward IFR after an MVFR start. The opposite is true for Rainy Pass. Look for gradual improvements throughout your day. Windy Pass we expect to start around VFR, and for Isabel Pass expect visual flight rule to start your day, but lowered ceilings and visibilities are expected. Mentasta Pass looks to be VFR, IFR to start your Sunday, and Tanita Pass with some gradual improvement. Same goes for Portage Pass. Look for a morning start at IFR for your Sunday, and for Chilcoot and White Pass, same conditions there. Look for a gradual improvement throughout the day. The freezing levels show a little bit of a change out in the west, but all in all, status quo. 2,000 foot there, freezing level just west of the Alaska Range. You can see some of the warmth once again surging northward, but mainly for the southeastern Gulf Coast line, anywhere from 4 to about 8,000 feet. Icing potential will still be with us out across the Chukchi Seacoast above 2,000 feet, some of that reaching isolated moderate. And you'll also notice a collection of regions that'll have some icing risk tomorrow around the Gulf Coast, of course, Cook Inlet, and west of Cape Newenham all the way out to the Pribilofs between 4,000 and about 6,000 feet and higher. The jet stream shows a pretty remarkable drop in the low pressure system out across the North Pacific. That trough has been with us for a very long time, but the orientation out west is changing somewhat, and that could allow some colder air to shift eastward in the coming days. A southerly flow will continue northward out across most of the state. With that, wind speeds around 20 knots or so all the way from the Gulf to the interior. Southwesterlies are a little bit stronger the further south you go toward the Pacific Northwest at about 40 to 70 knots. The north slope winds around the east and southeast really picking up as you get toward Point Barrow to 50 knots or so. Look for areas out across the Beaufort Seacoast to see those winds around 45 to 50 knots or so at 3,000 feet. Southerlies remain fairly weak out across the west coast at 10 to 20, and westerlies coming in across the Aleutians are picking up from 50 to 60 around the 3,000 foot level. Your turbulence potential then certainly still with us. Occasional moderate expected across the north slope below 5,000 feet. Watch for a few bumps and thumps as you move across the Alaska Range passes below 4,000 feet tomorrow, and for south central below 6,000 feet for the Prince William Sound side and the Chugach Range, and areas approaching the Cook Inlet coastline. Below 5,000 feet, you'll run into some isolated moderate for parts of central and southern parts of southeast, a little bit of a higher threat and risk as you head southward toward the Dixon entrance below 5,000 feet tomorrow. That's a look at your aviation forecast. I'll be back with the rest of your marine weather here in just a few minutes.
Up to now, we've assumed everything's going according to plan. But what if you're almost at rotation speed when the engine starts making a not-so-funny sound, or the oil pressure annunciator lights up, or some other situation tells you to reject the takeoff? How much pavement do you need to stop? Singles and many light twins don't publish stopping distances, but you can make reasonable estimates from the landing rollout numbers. Assuming you had to reject the takeoff at rotation speed, and you have to plan for the worst case without aggressive braking action, the stopping distance would be a little less than the landing rollout because you'll be rotating at a slightly lower speed than you'd be landing. To be safe, use the published landing distance to estimate how much runway you'll need.
Rejected takeoffs are another leading accident factor. If you have to apply heavy braking, don't let one foot overpower the other. Otherwise, you'll likely wind up going off the side of the runway, which doesn't help when you're trying to avoid going off the end of it. And make sure your feet are actually on the brakes. On some aircraft, the rudder and brake pedals are suspended from a torque tube. Riding too high on the pedals will result in pushing on the torque tube, not the brakes. Make sure you know where to position your feet for the most effective braking action on your machine. But everything's going smoothly today. Positive climb rate has been established, gear and flaps retracted. Time for the old climb-out debate. Do you climb at VX, best climb angle, and try to gain altitude while close to the airport, or do you climb at VY, best rate of climb, a speed that's more efficient and allows greater visibility over the nose?
Here's where art comes to the rescue of science. Each departure and climb-out has to be planned for the conditions that exist at that time, at that airport, and at that runway. However, the Air Safety Foundation advocates using VX, or best climb angle, only to avoid obstacles on takeoff. VY should be used after obstacles are cleared until a comfortable maneuvering altitude, 1,500 to 2,000 feet, AGL, is reached. After that, a cruise climb speed slightly higher than VY will provide better forward visibility and engine cooling. Those are the basics of the normal takeoff. We'll come back into the pattern for a normal landing. Many airports have visual indicators such as VASIs or PAPIs that tell you if you're high, low, or in the slot on your way to a perfect landing. Some runways are served by instrument landing systems, or ILSs. These approach aids also provide glide slope information. Let's head back into the pattern and talk about other factors that play a role in normal landing.
It doesn't get much easier than this. A long, wide runway and no wind. But as in takeoffs, most landing accidents happen without any help from adverse conditions. Runway conditions, required and available length, and off-field landing spots all have to be considered in preparation for landing, just as they do in the normal takeoff. Be aware of any anomalies in the runway, like poor braking action and rough spots. Failure to set flaps and trim correctly also takes a high toll, as they do on takeoff. Improper configuration is the 5th leading cause of landing accidents. Flaps help slow you down, lower the stall speed, and also allow you to make a steeper approach, giving you more altitude and a better view ahead. So be sure to crank them in, gang. The plane should be trimmed back to at least takeoff position. The Air Safety Foundation and FAA recommend a stabilized approach. That's called stabilized because power and control inputs are basically static, yielding the proper airspeed and descent rate. The goal is to establish the proper approach angle, airspeed, power setting, and configuration by the time the pilot reaches a target altitude, say 500 or 1,000 feet above the airport elevation, so the airplane flies itself to the runway. If you're not in final configuration on airspeed and altitude, you're not ready to land. Although the approach speeds of light aircraft can vary by as much as 50 knots, the optimal approach path of all is virtually identical, about 3 degrees pitch down for a normal landing, slightly steeper on a short or obstructed field. That's why the approach path, as defined by a VASI or ILS, is the same for all aircraft. The speed changes, but the approach angle stays the same. Flying a stabilized approach assures you'll stay on the proper glide path and reach the runway at the right airspeed. What is key is recognizing the proper glide path. Visualizing the proper glide path can be difficult because topography can play visual tricks. If the runway sits up on a raised parcel of land, the correct approach angle is apt to look high from the cockpit. You should have a target on the runway, a spot you're aiming for as your landing point. If you're on target, the spot won't move up or down in the windshield, it will just get bigger. Even in the absence of wind, up and down drafts can affect your flight path. The topography, ground cover, and weather can all influence the stability of the air. On a sunny day, up and down drafts will be created by uneven heating of the air, as heat is reflected back or absorbed by the earth. And any air movement, if it encounters rising or falling terrain, will also lead to instability of the air. Here's where the art of flying, of reading the conditions and manipulating the controls accordingly, comes into play. One of the oldest debates in aviation is whether pitch or power controls airspeed and which controls vertical speed. The reality is, when you're flying an approach, if you want to maintain the proper glide path and constant speed in anything but smooth air, you're going to have to work both the throttle and the elevator, and inputs on one will affect the response of the other. Discuss this with your instructor and ask for a demonstration. Always be ready to go around. Plan on it. That will keep you flexible and your options open. But be ready to deal with the demands of a go-around. This is not a risk-free maneuver. For example, adding full power when you have full flaps and nose-high trim set can create impressive pitch-up attitudes that can result in a stall. In fact, the go-around ranks number 6 in landing accident causes. That's why elevator trim stalls are now required as part of the private pilot flight test. As you start your flare, look down the runway. Put the top of the cowl above the end of the runway and hold it there. That will keep you adding more and more back pressure, and the plane will land itself. Remember the nose-up attitude you established on takeoff? That's exactly the same attitude the aircraft should be in when landing. Don't release back pressure after ground contact. Hold the yoke back to keep the attitude as nose-high as possible on rollout, using the airframe itself for aerodynamic braking. And after exiting the runway, pull all the way over the hold lines, dash past the dashed lines. Then contact ground control and complete the after-landing checklist. Okay, we've seen the basics of how to handle normal takeoffs and landings. Now, I want to show you some examples of landings our cameras captured at a recent fly-in. The conditions that day required normal piloting technique, but some of the landings you'll see are anything but normal. Let's rate them from 1 to 10, 10 being superior. I'll be using my official landometer calibration system, which is a completely subjective measuring tool I carry around in my head. Why don't you rate these performances too? And we'll see how our scores match up. No one can accuse this pilot of being too hot on final. Kaboom! Okay, he's gonna try it again. There, that's better. The first landing would have been great on an aircraft carrier, but here on land, I've got to give that a 3.9. This Cessna looks like the pilot's got everything under control. Yep. Now the flare. He's got a bit of a float. Make that a lot of float. This is what happens with excessive airspeed. Now, here he comes, but he's still not done. Yes, the landing was good, but he used up too much of the runway to get to his touchdown point. That rates a 6.0 in my book. This Cessna 150 is a little hot. Holding the nose off. Very nice. Yeah, it would have earned an 8, but we're going to have to deduct a point for excessive airspeed. Oh, and look at this. The pilot's retracting the flaps on the runway. Not the safest way to fly. We should concentrate on the rollout and avoid configuration changes until clear of the runway. Otherwise, there's the possibility of losing control or, in a retractable gear airplane, raising the gear instead of the flaps. We're going to have to deduct something for that, too. I'll give it a 6. Okay, this Piper is set up for a good landing. Good airspeed and attitude, but a little burble on final can mess up a nice approach. You've got to be ready for that. Nice recovery. I'll give it an even 7. Here's a beautiful landing. Compliments of a Beach Bonanza. Good attitude, directional control, and good for a hefty 9.7 on the Landometer. This Cessna 150 pilot's not sure what to do with the elevator. Pulls it back, pushes it forward, pulls it back, pushes it forward. Okay, he finally has it in the right attitude and is smart enough to keep it there, keeping the nose wheel off the runway. On balance, that rates a big 7 in my book. This 182 appears set up nicely, but wait, the pilot lets the nose drop. Ouch! We hope he didn't do that on purpose, but he's sure giving his oleo strut a workout. And the local A&P might get some work out of this too. Can you say potential prop strike? That's a 2.0 arrival in my book. Here it is from the reverse angle. Look how nicely the plane's set up and how quickly it all goes south. Ouch! That's what happens when you don't maintain the proper landing attitude. This Saratoga pilot has everything under control. Good airspeed, good attitude, just a little bit off the center line after touchdown. And that's good for a solid 8.5 on the Landometer.
Of the St. Matthew Island region. As a result, with that northeasterly wind dropping southward, it's bringing that ice edge a little bit closer to St. Matthew, about 30 to 40 nautical miles or so. Not a whole lot of change inside of Cook Inlet. Everything you see in white right now is holding around 80% or higher. Here's a look at the winds now for southeast, south and easterly winds coming up the central and southern parts of southeast. Southerlies into the Lynn Canal at 15 knots. Light easterly offshore winds at 10 to 15. More of a westerly flow coming into the Dixon entrance region at 30 knots with a 13-foot sea. That becomes southeasterly with time on Monday. And the offshore winds pick up 20 to 30. A southwesterly wind on President's Day up toward Yakutat at 10 knots with a 10-foot sea. And southeasterlies also picking up on the inside waters 20 to 25 with a 4 to 5-foot sea. They're northerlies across the Lynn Canal with a 3-foot sea. North and easterly winds coming now Cook Inlet 20 to 30. A southwesterly flow inside of Shelikof Strait 15 knots with a 4-foot sea. Southerlies on the northern and western Gulf Coast 25 knots or so with 10 to 11-foot seas, and easterlies inside of Prince William Sound with a 4-foot sea on a 20-knot wind. For Monday, look for those winds to diminish down to 10 knots with a 2-foot sea. Southwesterlies from the Barren Islands eastward and up through Resurrection Bay, a 15-knot wind with an 8 to 9-foot sea. 10-foot seas coming into Kodiak Island on a 15-knot wind, and otherwise light and variable winds from Cook Inlet all the way through the Shelikof Strait region. The Alaska Peninsula looking at light and variable winds at about 10 to 15 on Sunday. 2-foot seas expected inside of Bristol Bay and down the Bering Sea coast with a southwesterly flow a little bit stronger, about 20 to 25 with an 11 to 12-foot sea coming into Castle Cape. And as we get into Monday, winds are still fairly light across the Bering Sea coast and inside of Bristol Bay with only 1 to 2-foot seas there. Winds blowing at 10 knots and a 15-knot wind across the Pacific coast. You'll see those winds coming in from the south and east to Castle Cape through Chignik, and a northeasterly flow south of Sand Point, 15 knots with a 9-foot sea there. For the Aleutians, winds about 15 to 20 knots out in the west. Light and variable flow on the Bering Sea coast. West and northwesterly winds for the central and western sections of the Pacific coast. And then a southwesterly flow south of Unalaska to Nikolsky. That around 20 knots or so. For Monday, a little bit more of a change. A gale blowing in across the western chain, 30 to 40 knots, a 10 to 12-foot seas coming in. Look for winds to pick up across the central chain, 20 to 30 knots with a south and westerly flow turning into more of a northwesterly wind around the Unalaska and Nikolsky region, 15 to 20 there, with a 4 to 7 foot sea on either side. For the west coast, northerlies coming down through the Bering Strait, northeasterlies helping to move that ice edge just a little bit further south, 20 knots across St. Paul and St. George with a 6 foot sea. And for Monday, 15 to 20 knots expected across the YK Delta and all the way out toward the Pribilofs with a 1 foot sea south of Nunivak Island, 4 foot seas around the Pribilofs, and 6 foot seas around St. Matthew and the island waters there. Watch for freezing spray closer to the ice edge. For Sunday, winds will still be up around 35 knots across the Beaufort Seacoast, a little bit slower out across Point Lay to Wainwright, and then winds around 10 to 15 knots across the Chukchi Seacoast and into Kotzebue Sound. For Monday, winds diminish a little bit more. See, they're still not entirely gone. We're 30 knots there from the east, 20 knots from Wainwright down toward Point Lay, and more of a west and northwesterly flow coming into Cape Lisburn, Point Hope, and the outer parts of Kotzebue Sound. Remember, a blizzard warning is still in effect for the North Slope, all the way from Icy Cape eastward to Kaktovik. That'll go until 6 o'clock tomorrow morning. The winds will still be up through a large part of Sunday, but conditions should start to ease up and improve as we go through your Sunday. A blizzard means there is whiteout conditions across the region, and we expect heavy drifting snow and impassable and impossible conditions outside. So be extra careful if you do have to go outside for any reason. As you look across the interior, conditions are far better. Look for clouds and spotty areas of snow showers for the south central and southwestern areas. Rain mixed with snow is possible, but anything we see should be fairly light. A better chance for some light rain scattered about southeastern Alaska with a new wave of weather working up the eastern Gulf Coast. Out across the west, a new zone of low pressure is organizing a little bit there. You don't see much on Sunday, but up north conditions will start to improve even as snow and blowing snow continues, especially for the central Beaufort Seacoast. By Monday, conditions are still improving, not entirely improved overall just yet, but a new weather maker enters the western Bering Sea at 962 millibars and a new low in the central Gulf at 982.
These forecasts are to be used for planning purposes only. Call 1-800-WX-BRIEF for a formal pre-flight briefing. Always file a flight plan before you go flying. The U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary urges you to leave a float plan with a friend or the harbor master before you go boating. Alaska Weather is made possible by the following sponsors.
The National Weather Service.
Support comes from the University of Alaska College Savings Plan, helping you and your child save for college every step of the way, from diapers to diploma. More information at uacollegesavings.com.